Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Have you ever heard of an empire that was supposed to have fallen, that everyone agreed had fallen, that historians wrote the obituary for and that kept going anyway? Not for a generation, not for a century, but for more than 1,000 years after the civilization that created it had already ceased to exist. Tonight we're going to talk about Byzantium, an empire that called itself Roman long after Rome had crumbled into weeds in memory. An empire that sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, absorbed every plague, every invasion, every internal catastrophe the medieval world could produce, and refused, with a stubbornness that borders on the miraculous, to stop existing. This is not a story about decline, though there is plenty of decline. It is a story about adaptation, about the remarkable human capacity to take something inherited and make it new without ever quite admitting that is what you are doing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean that sincerely. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that this story is settling over people in dozens of different time zones at once. Some of you just ending your day, some of you deep in the middle of a sleepless night, some of you somewhere in between. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere to be. And let us ease together into one of the longest stories the medieval world ever produced. The city that would become the heart of Byzantium was chosen with the instinct of a man who understood geography, the way other men understand language. Constantine, the Roman emperor who would give the city his name, stood on a finger of land jutting into the water where Europe and Asia pressed closest to one another, where the Black Sea narrowed into the Bosphorus Strait and the Bosphorus opened into the Sea of Marmara, and the Sea of Marmara reached toward the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean beyond. He would have understood immediately what the site meant. Water on 3 sides, a natural harbour on the 4th, a sheltered inlet the Greeks had always called the Golden Horn, hills rising behind the water to give defenders the advantage of height, a position commanding the single most important maritime choke point in the known world. Every ship moving between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through the Bosphorus. Every army marching between Europe and Asia had to either cross the strait or go around it, which in practical terms meant going around the entire Black Sea, a journey of thousands of miles. Whoever held this city held the key to 2 continents. The founding of Constantinople in 330 CE was not, in Constantine's mind, the founding of something new. It was the refounding of something old. Rome itself. The empire he ruled was the Roman Empire, the same institution that had governed most of the known world for centuries, the same succession of power that ran back through Augustus and Julius Caesar and the Republic before them to the city on the Tiber. Constantine was not creating a second Rome, he was moving Rome. He called his new capital Nova Roma, New Rome, though the name that stuck was the one the inhabitants used informally from the very beginning. Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The men and women who lived there for the next 11 centuries would call themselves Romans without hesitation or irony. They spoke Greek as their everyday language, worshipped according to the forms of Christian theology that had developed largely in the Eastern Mediterranean, and governed according to traditions that had drifted considerably from anything Augustus would have recognized. But they were Romans. That identity was not a pretense. It was the central fact of their civilization. Understanding this is essential before the rest of the story makes sense. We tend to call them Byzantines because a German historian named Hieronymus Wolff coined that term in the 16th century as a way of distinguishing the Eastern Roman Empire from the Western one, and from the ancient Roman state that had preceded both. The Byzantines themselves would have found the label incomprehensible. They had a word for their empire, it was Romania, and a word for themselves, Romaioi, Romans. But before we can talk about what Byzantium became, we need to understand the world it was born from, and the crisis that made its existence necessary in the first place. The Roman Empire of the 3rd century CE was a civilization under enormous stress. The empire that Augustus had assembled had been built on the assumption of expansion, on the steady incorporation of new territories, new populations, new sources of tribute and tax revenue. By the 2nd century, that expansion had largely stopped. The borders had stabilized along lines. The Rhine and Danube in the north, the Euphrates in the east, the desert edges in Africa, that proved difficult to push further. An empire that had been designed to grow found itself in the unfamiliar position of holding what it had, while outside pressure built steadily against every frontier simultaneously. The 3rd century produced a succession of military crises so severe that historians call the period between 235 and 284 CE the crisis of the 3rd century, without any real need to justify the dramatic label. In those 50 years, the Roman Empire came closer to complete dissolution than at any point in its history. Roughly 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them died violently. Large portions of the empire operated under breakaway governments for extended periods. The currency was debased to near worthlessness. Trade networks contracted. Cities shrank behind hastily constructed walls. The elaborate administrative machinery that had governed 3 continents began to seize and grind. Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE and ruled for 20 years, stabilized the situation through sheer administrative will. His solution to the problem of governing an empire too large for one man to manage was to formalize what had already been happening informally. He divided imperial authority among 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. The arrangement was called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was a practical response to real geography. An emperor in the west could respond to crises on the Rhine and in Britain and North Africa without waiting for orders to travel across thousands of miles from a court in the east. An emperor in the east could manage the Persian frontier and the Danube without neglecting the armies on the other side of the Aegean. Diocletian himself ruled from Nicomedia in northwestern Anatolia rather than from Rome, a choice that signalled something important about where the real weight of the empire had shifted. The city of Rome was still symbolically central, but it was no longer where decisions got made. Constantine inherited this divided world and then reassembled it through a series of civil wars that left him sole emperor by 324 CE. His decision 6 years later to build a new capital on the Bosphorus was the culmination of a shift that had been developing for decades. The east was richer than the west. The eastern provinces had always been more densely populated, more urbanized, more commercially active, more deeply integrated into the long-distance trading networks that connected the Mediterranean world to Persia and beyond. Egypt alone produced enough grain to feed much of the empire. Syria and Asia Minor were centres of manufacturing and skilled craftsmanship. The Greek-speaking cities of the eastern Mediterranean had been the intellectual heart of the Roman world for centuries. Moving the capital east was not abandoning Rome. It was following the money, the population, and the strategic reality, and building a new city from scratch, rather than moving into one of the existing eastern capitals, allowed Constantine to design a centre of power that bore his own stamp entirely. The city he built was spectacular. He modelled it on Rome in ways that were meant to be immediately recognisable. Constantinople had 7 hills like Rome. It had a forum at its centre, like Rome. It had a senate, a circus for chariot racing, public baths, triumphal columns, and neighbourhoods laid out along the same organisational principles that Rome used. Constantine stripped statues and artworks from cities across the empire to decorate his new capital. He built a hippodrome directly adjacent to his palace complex so that the imperial family could watch the races from a private box that connected directly to the throne room. The hippodrome would become the social centre of Constantinople's public life for the next 8 centuries, the place where tens of thousands of citizens gathered to watch chariot races, to cheer for their favoured teams, to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor, and occasionally to riot. Constantine also built churches, many churches. His relationship to Christianity is one of the most debated questions in late antique history. Whether he was a sincere convert or a shrewd politician who recognised the organisational and ideological utility of a rapidly growing universal faith is a question his own behaviour never quite settles. Probably both are true in proportions that varied depending on the moment. What is certain is that his Edict of Milan in 313, issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, ended the official persecution of Christians throughout the empire and returned confiscated church property. And that the city he built on the Bosphorus was from the beginning a Christian city in ways that Rome, with its ancient pagan temples and traditions, could never quite be. When Constantine died in 337 CE, the empire he left behind was theoretically unified but practically fragile. His 3 sons divided it among themselves and then fought over the pieces. The pattern of imperial division and civil war that had characterized the 3rd century reasserted itself. What had changed, however, was the religious dimension. The empire was now officially Christian, or at least officially tolerant of Christianity, and the theological arguments that consumed the attention of bishops and emperors were no longer purely ecclesiastical. They were political. The argument over Arianism, the theological position that held that Christ was a created being subordinate to God the Father rather than co-equal with him, divided the church and the court simultaneously for decades. Constantine himself had convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 to resolve the question, producing the Nicene Creed that defined Orthodox Christian belief. The council produced a creed but not a resolution. Arguments about the precise relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit continued consuming imperial politics for another half-century. Theodosius I, who ruled as sole emperor from 379 to 395 CE, made the Orthodox Nicene Christianity not merely the favoured, but the legally mandated religion of the Roman state. Pagan sacrifice was prohibited. Heresy was a crime. The great temples of the ancient world were closed, repurposed, or destroyed. When Theodosius died in 395, he divided the empire between his 2 sons in a way that turned out to be permanent: Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. The 2 halves of the empire had always been administered separately to some degree, and had often had different emperors simultaneously. But after 395, they would never again be governed by a single ruler for any sustained period. The Western Empire continued for another 80 years under a succession of increasingly ineffectual emperors, their actual power held by military commanders of various barbarian origins. In 476, the last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, whose name managed to combine both the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire in a single person, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who saw no reason to bother propping up the imperial fiction any longer. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The message was clear, and the Eastern court understood it perfectly. There was only one Roman emperor now. He lived in Constantinople. He had always been the senior figure anyway. The Eastern Empire that Theodosius's son Arcadius inherited in 395 was still enormous, by any standard other than comparison to what Rome had once been. It controlled Greece, the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and a stretch of North Africa. Its population numbered perhaps 30 million people. Its tax revenue, though strained by continuous military expenditure, was still the largest single financial operation in the Mediterranean world. Its army, though heavily dependent on Germanic and other non-Roman recruits, was still the most organised military force in the region, and its capital, Constantinople, was by the late 4th century already the largest city in the Christian world. The city grew with extraordinary speed. Constantine's original walls had enclosed a substantial area, but within a generation the population had already pushed beyond them. In the early 5th century, under the Emperor Theodosius II and his regent Anthemius, the city was given the enormous set of triple walls that would define its silhouette for the next 1,000 years. The Theodosian walls ran across the landward side of the peninsula, nearly 4 miles from the Golden Horn in the north to the Sea of Marmara in the south. They consisted of 3 separate defensive lines: an outer wall, a higher inner wall, and a series of 96 towers spaced at regular intervals. Between the outer wall and the moat beyond it, there was a wide terrace. Between the outer and inner walls, another terrace. An attacking army faced a succession of obstacles, each more formidable than the last, and would need to breach all 3 before reaching the city itself. No army would successfully breach those walls by direct assault for the next 1,000 years. They were perhaps the single most consequential piece of military architecture in medieval history. The 6th century produced the figure that looms largest over the entire early Byzantine period. Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE, was one of those historical personalities whose ambitions seemed to exceed the capacity of a single human lifetime, and who managed by sheer force of will and organisational genius to accomplish most of what he intended anyway, at a cost that left the empire exhausted for generations. He was born in a village in what is now Macedonia, or perhaps Serbia, the son of a peasant family, and owed his position entirely to the fact that his uncle Justin had risen through the military to become emperor in 518. When Justin died, his nephew, who had effectively been managing the government for years, took the throne. He was about 45 years old. He would rule for nearly 4 more decades. Justinian's ambitions were straightforward in concept and staggering in scope. He wanted to reunite the Roman Empire, the western provinces that had fallen to Germanic kingdoms over the previous century, Italy under the Ostrogoths, North Africa under the Vandals, Spain under the Visigoths, were in his view not lost but temporarily occupied. He was the Roman emperor. Those lands were Roman lands. They would be reclaimed. His general Belisarius, one of the most gifted military commanders of the ancient or medieval world, began the reconquest in 533 with a campaign against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The campaign succeeded with a speed that astonished everyone, including Belisarius. The Vandal kingdom, which had controlled North Africa for a century, collapsed in 2 pitched battles over a matter of months. Belisarius entered Carthage without a siege. He found the Vandal king's wine still cooling in the cellar, still awaiting a dinner that never happened. It was the kind of detail that ancient and medieval historians loved to record, and it captured something real about how completely the Vandal resistance had been overwhelmed. Italy followed, beginning in 535. It did not go nearly as cleanly. The Gothic War, as it is known, lasted 20 years. The Ostrogoths proved far more resilient opponents than the Vandals. The war swept back and forth across the Italian peninsula, reducing cities that had survived the chaos of the 5th century to rubble. Rome changed hands multiple times. At one point, the Goths threatened to destroy the aqueducts and flood the city's lower districts. The population of Rome, which had already contracted enormously from its imperial peak, contracted further still. The countryside was stripped by competing armies. Italy emerged from the Gothic War physically devastated in ways it would not fully recover from for centuries. Justinian's generals eventually prevailed, but the Italy they reconquered was a ruin. The province of Spain was partially recovered in the 550s, when a Visigothic civil war gave Justinian's forces an opening to establish a foothold in the southeast. But the full reconquest of the old Western Empire, even had Justinian lived another century, was probably never achievable with the resources available to him. At home, Justinian's reign produced 2 achievements that outlasted his military campaigns by centuries. The first was legal. Roman law had accumulated over 1,000 years into a body of texts so voluminous, contradictory and difficult to navigate that practicing lawyers and imperial administrators found it nearly impossible to use. Justinian commissioned a small group of legal scholars, under the direction of a jurist named Tribonian, to compile, organise, and rationalise the entire tradition. The result, completed between 529 and 534, was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It consisted of the Codex, an organised collection of imperial legislation, the Digest, a compilation of writings from the great classical jurists with contradictions resolved, the Institutes, an introductory textbook, and the Novels, a collection of Justinian's own legislation. The Corpus Juris Civilis became the foundation of legal education and legal practice throughout the Byzantine world. When it was rediscovered in Western Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries, it became the basis for the legal systems of most of continental Europe, and through those systems influenced virtually every legal tradition in the modern world, except the Anglo-American common law. It is not an exaggeration to say that the legal framework within which most of the world's 7 billion people live their lives today was shaped in significant measure by decisions made in Justinian's Constantinople. The second achievement was architectural, and it stands today in Istanbul as one of the most extraordinary buildings human beings have ever constructed. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was built in Constantinople between 532 and 537, a period of 5 years that still astonishes structural engineers. The previous church on the site had been burned in the Nika riots of 532, a catastrophic urban uprising that nearly ended Justinian's reign before it had properly begun. The riots began as a dispute between the chariot racing factions, the Blues and Greens, that dominated Constantinople's hippodrome culture and that served as the primary vehicle for public political expression in a city where organised opposition to the emperor was otherwise impossible. The rioters demanded the dismissal of unpopular officials, then turned their fury against the government itself, burning large sections of the city and proclaiming a new emperor. Justinian, by most contemporary accounts, was preparing to flee by ship when his wife Theodora intervened with words that Procopius, the historian who recorded them, placed among the most remarkable ever spoken by a woman of her era or any era. She told the assembled court that she did not wish to live to see herself stripped of imperial purple, that she found the old saying compelling, that the purple was a noble burial shroud, that those who had lived as monarchs could not bear to live as exiles. It was not an abstract statement of principle. She was telling her husband and his generals to stop running. Justinian stayed. The generals Belisarius and Mundus moved against the rioters in the Hippodrome. Estimates of the dead run to 30,000. The uprising was over, and from its ashes Justinian built the Hagia Sophia. The architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus designed a building that had no real precedent. Its central dome, roughly 30 metres in diameter, appears to float above the nave, supported not by the walls beneath it but by a series of half-domes and arches that distribute the dome's weight outward and downward in ways that were not fully understood even by the builders themselves. Around the base of the dome, 40 windows let in light in a band that makes the dome appear to hover detached from its supports, resting on air and illumination rather than stone. When Justinian entered the completed church for the first time, he is supposed to have said simply, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Whether he actually said it is impossible to verify. What is certain is that the Hagia Sophia transformed the experience of interior space in ways that had never been done before, that it served as the patriarchal cathedral of Constantinople for nearly 1,000 years, that it became a mosque for another 5 centuries after that, and that it stands today as one of the visited buildings on Earth, still capable of producing in first-time visitors the same stunned silence it produced in those who first entered it in 537. Justinian's reign also coincided with the arrival of the Justinianic plague in 541, the first great pandemic of bubonic plague to strike the Mediterranean world. The disease arrived in Egypt via grain ships from somewhere further east, possibly Central Africa or Central Asia, and spread with terrible efficiency through the densely populated cities of the empire. Constantinople was hit with catastrophic severity. Contemporary sources describe bodies piling up faster than the living could bury them, mass graves dug outside the walls, the normal structures of commerce and governance breaking down as a significant fraction of the population died within months. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world in its initial outbreak and returned repeatedly for the next 2 centuries. Its effects on the Byzantine economy, army and tax base were severe and long-lasting. Justinian himself caught the plague, nearly died, recovered, and continued governing. But the empire he governed after the plague's arrival was measurably smaller, poorer, and less capable of sustaining the military effort that his reconquest ambitions required. When Justinian died in 565, he left an empire that was geographically larger than it had been when he inherited it, but financially and demographically weaker. The reconquered western provinces were shallow acquisitions, expensive to defend and incompletely integrated into the imperial system. Italy would begin slipping away almost immediately, as the Lombards invaded in 568 and seized large portions of the peninsula that the Gothic War had so recently and expensively reclaimed. The ambition of the Justinianic project was genuine, and in certain respects permanently influential. But the price was a military and fiscal overextension that would define the crises of the following century. The 7th century was the most dangerous period in Byzantine history, a sequence of catastrophes so severe that the empire's continued existence seemed genuinely in doubt at multiple points within a single lifetime. It began with Persia, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which had been the Byzantine world's great eastern rival for 3 centuries, launched under its king Khosrow II an offensive of extraordinary ambition. Between 603 and 628, Persian armies swept through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine world. Jerusalem fell in 614, and the Persians carried away the true cross, the relic believed to be the actual wood of Christ's crucifixion, an act that struck the Christian world with the force of a theological catastrophe as much as a military one. Egypt, the granary of the empire, was lost in 619. Constantinople itself was besieged in 626 by a combined Persian and Avar force, pressing from both sides of the Bosphorus, the most dangerous moment the city had faced since its founding. The emperor who navigated all of this was Heraclius, and his story reads less like Byzantine administrative history and more like the kind of narrative that ancient epic poets invented. He had come to power in 610 by sailing from North Africa to Constantinople with a force of loyal troops and removing the genuinely terrible emperor Phocas. He inherited an empire in crisis so acute that he reportedly considered moving the capital to Carthage. He stayed in Constantinople instead, reorganized what remained of the military and the financial system with considerable ingenuity, and then launched a series of campaigns against Persia that rank among the most remarkable military performances of the medieval world. Between 622 and 628, he drove deep into Persian territory, winning battles in what is now Armenia, Iraq, and Iran, striking at the symbolic and economic heart of the Persian state with the same focus and speed that Persian armies had applied to Byzantine Syria and Egypt a decade earlier. The Persians, destabilized by his campaigns and by internal political crisis, sued for peace. The true cross was returned. The lost provinces came back. Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph. It was one of the great military comebacks in the history of any empire. He had perhaps 4 years to enjoy it before everything changed again. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab armies that had been gathering under the banner of Islam in the years since Muhammad's first revelations began to move with a speed and intensity that neither Byzantium nor Persia had anticipated or fully understood. The Arabs were not a new threat in the abstract sense. Both empires had dealt with Arab raiders and auxiliaries for centuries, but these were not raiders. They were armies shaped by a new faith, motivated by a conviction that was quite different from the territorial ambitions or dynastic concerns that had driven previous invaders. They moved into Persian territory first, and the already exhausted Sassanid Empire, bled white by decades of warfare with Byzantium, collapsed with a finality that still surprises. The Persian Empire as a political entity ceased to exist within 20 years of Muhammad's death. Then the Arabs turned toward Byzantine Syria and Palestine. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Yarmouk in August of 636 in a river valley in what is today southern Syria. A Byzantine army, probably substantially larger than the Arab force, was destroyed over several days of fighting. The details of exactly what happened remain debated, but the result was not. Syria fell, Palestine followed. Egypt, which Heraclius had so recently and painfully reclaimed from Persia, fell to Arab armies under Amr ibn al-Az in 641, the same year Heraclius died. The loss of Egypt was arguably the single most consequential territorial change in Byzantine history. Egypt's grain had fed Constantinople. Egypt's tax revenue had underwritten much of the military budget. Egypt's papyrus had supplied the bureaucratic apparatus with the material it needed to function. Losing Egypt meant losing the economic foundation of the empire as it had existed for centuries. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the Arab conquest was not simply smaller. It was fundamentally different in structure, in economy, and in the kind of state it was capable of being. The response to this crisis produced what historians call the theme system, one of the most significant administrative reorganizations in Byzantine history. Faced with the impossible problem of defending a much-reduced empire with depleted resources, the Byzantine government began assigning large military districts called themes, from the Greek word for a regiment, to military governors called strategoi, who combined military and civilian authority in their regions. Soldiers in the themes were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a system in which the army partially supported itself from the agricultural production of the territories it was defending rather than drawing entirely on centralized tax revenue. The system was not invented all at once. It evolved over the course of the 7th century as necessity pushed administrative improvisation towards something approaching a coherent policy. But the result was an empire that had learned to fight on the cheap, to defend in depth, to absorb raids rather than trying to prevent them, and to preserve its core territories by trading the indefensible periphery. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the 7th century's catastrophes was smaller, poorer, and more Greek in character than the empire Justinian had ruled. But it had survived, and survival, at this particular moment in Mediterranean history, was a considerable achievement. The Constantinople that the Arab armies failed to capture in 2 major sieges, in 674 to 678, and again in 717 to 718, was defended partly by its walls, partly by its navy, and partly by a weapon that had no precedent in the ancient world and would not be fully understood by modern chemistry until the 20th century. Greek fire, as it came to be called, was a substance that burned on water, that could not be extinguished by water, and that could be projected from tubes mounted on warships with enough range and force to set enemy vessels alight at distance. The Arab naval forces that attempted to blockade Constantinople in the 600s and 70s found their wooden ships catching fire in ways that violated everything their sailors understood about the behaviour of flame. The fleet broke. The siege was lifted. Greek fire would save Constantinople again in 718, and its formula, jealously guarded as a state secret, would remain one of the Byzantine Empire's most closely held military assets for centuries. The exact composition of Greek fire is still unknown. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various combinations of petroleum, quicklime, sulphur, and other compounds, but no one has been able to reproduce it precisely. The Byzantines apparently managed to lose the formula themselves at some point in the 11th or 12th century, which tells you something either about the fragility of institutional knowledge or about the quality of Byzantine record-keeping in that period, or perhaps both. The 8th century brought a different kind of crisis, one that came not from outside the walls but from within the theology that gave the empire its identity. The iconoclast controversy, which dominated Byzantine politics and religious life for most of the century and returned for a second round in the 9th, began in 726 when the Emperor Leo III ordered the removal and destruction of religious images, beginning with a famous image of Christ above the chalk gate, the main entrance to the imperial palace complex. His theological reasoning drew on a long tradition of suspicion about the use of images in Christian worship, the concern that venerating images of Christ and the saints crossed the line into idolatry. His practical reasoning was also influenced, almost certainly, by the remarkable military successes of the iconoclastic Islamic forces pressing against the empire's frontiers, which some Byzantine thinkers interpreted as evidence of divine disfavour provoked by the empire's excessive use of religious images. The response from the church hierarchy, from monasteries, and from a significant portion of the population was fierce. Pope Gregory III convened a synod in Rome that condemned iconoclasm. The Patriarch of Constantinople was eventually replaced with an iconoclast sympathiser. Monks who refused to destroy images were persecuted. The Empress Irene, who served as regent for her young son Constantine VI after 780, restored the veneration of images at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, the last ecumenical council recognised by both the Eastern and Western churches. Iconoclasm returned under Leo V in 815 and was finally ended only in 843, an event still commemorated in the Orthodox calendar as the triumph of orthodoxy. The controversy mattered for reasons that extended well beyond the theological question of whether it was appropriate to kiss a painted image of the Virgin Mary. It drove a permanent wedge between Constantinople and Rome, deepening the cultural and ecclesiastical division between what would eventually become the Orthodox and Catholic churches. It disrupted relations between the emperor and the powerful monastic communities, whose spiritual authority gave them a platform for resistance that secular opponents of imperial policy did not have. And it raised in particularly sharp form a question that Byzantine political culture was always uncomfortable discussing directly: whether the emperor had the right to dictate theological truth, and if so, what recourse the church had when it disagreed. The 9th century brought relative stability and a period of cultural achievement that historians sometimes call the Macedonian Renaissance, named for the dynasty that came to power when Basil I, a peasant from Macedonia, who had risen through court intrigue and the murder of his predecessor, seized the throne in 867. The Macedonian dynasty would rule Constantinople for nearly 2 centuries, and under its longer reigning emperors the empire achieved a prosperity, cultural confidence, and military effectiveness that made it the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. The recovery of Byzantine power in the 9th and 10th centuries rested on several foundations. The theme system had stabilized the frontier. The Arab Caliphate was beginning to fragment politically, reducing the coordinated pressure on the eastern border. The conversion of the Bulgarians in 864 removed one persistent threat from the Balkans, though it would take another century of warfare to fully pacify the Bulgarian state. And the empire had gradually rebuilt its tax base as the administrative disruptions of the 7th century gave way to more effective governance. The cultural achievements of the Macedonian period were real and significant. Constantinople in the 9th and 10th centuries was the intellectual centre of the Christian world, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, vastly larger than anything in Western Europe, where Charlemagne's greatest city, Aachen, had perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, and Rome itself was a shadow of what it had been. The imperial library contained texts that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Byzantine scholars copied and preserved manuscripts of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, and science, passing them through the medieval centuries in forms that would eventually reach Western Europe and fuel the Renaissance. The University of Constantinople, reorganized under Caesar Bardus in the 800s and 50s, trained administrators and theologians and scholars in classical traditions that the Islamic world was also preserving and extending in parallel. The missionary activity of Saints Cyril and Methodius, supported by Constantinople, carried Orthodox Christianity and a new alphabet into the Slavic world, shaping the religious and cultural identity of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and most of Slavic Eastern Europe in ways whose effects are still entirely visible in the world today. But it is the warrior emperors of the Macedonian dynasty's later generations who tend to capture the imagination most immediately, because they did something that had seemed barely possible a century earlier. They expanded. Nicephorus Phocas, who seized the throne in 963 and ruled until his murder in 969, was a general's general, a man who had spent his adult life on the eastern frontier fighting Arab raiders in Anatolia, and who brought to the imperial office the organisational habits and the tactical thinking of someone who had never found a problem that more cavalry and better logistics could not solve. He recaptured Cilicia and parts of Syria from Arab control. He reconquered Crete, which had been a base for Muslim pirates raiding the Aegean for over a century. His campaigns into Syria reached Antioch, which was retaken for the empire in 969. John Zimisces, who murdered Nicephorus and took the throne, pushed further still, conducting campaigns that brought Byzantine armies to the outskirts of Jerusalem. This was not quite another Justinianic reconquest, and the Byzantines had the strategic wisdom not to push so far that they could not hold what they had taken. But it was evidence that the patient defensive posture of the previous 3 centuries had paid off. The empire had survived its worst century, rebuilt its strength, and was now capable of taking ground rather than merely defending it. Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, is by common consent the greatest military emperor in Byzantine history, and probably the most effective ruler the empire ever produced. He came to the throne as a teenager and spent the first decade of his reign fighting to maintain it against 2 major aristocratic revolts. The experience taught him things about the Byzantine ruling class that he never forgot and never forgave. He emerged from those early crises with a profound and permanent suspicion of the powerful military families whose estates in Anatolia gave them the private armies that made revolt possible, and he spent much of his reign systematically reducing their power through legislation that limited large landowners' ability to absorb the small holdings of military farmers. The peasant soldiers of the theme system were the backbone of his army, and he protected their economic position with a tenacity that the great aristocratic families found infuriating and that the empire's long-term military capability required. His campaign against Bulgaria was the defining military achievement of his reign, and the source of the epithet by which history remembers him: Basil the Bulgaroktonos, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. The Bulgarian Empire under Samuel had been the dominant power in the Balkans for decades, a state that had inflicted crushing defeats on Byzantine armies and that had expanded its territory at Byzantine expense. Basil spent nearly 20 years in a grinding attritional campaign that eventually destroyed the Bulgarian army's ability to resist. At the Battle of Cladion in 1014, he captured approximately 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. He blinded 99 of every 100, leaving one eye to every 100th man to lead the rest back to their king. When Samuel saw the army of blind men returning to him, he suffered what the chronicles describe as a stroke and died 2 days later. The action was deliberately savage and deliberately visible. It was meant to communicate something about the cost of continued resistance. Within 4 years, Bulgaria had been absorbed into the empire. The Balkans were Byzantine for the first time since the 7th century. When Basil died in 1025 without an heir, leaving the throne to a series of incompetent relatives and bureaucratic emperors who lacked his combination of military ability and administrative ruthlessness, the stage was set for the crisis that would define the empire's middle period. The central military problem was the same one that had troubled Byzantine governments since the theme system's establishment: the tension between the needs of the professional army that the campaigns of reconquest had required, and the economic interests of the great Anatolian landowners who resented the fiscal and legal constraints that Basil had imposed on them. The aristocrats won the political argument in the decades after Basil's death, as weak emperors relaxed the constraints on large landholding, and the small-holding military farmers who had provided the empire's best infantry began losing their land and their economic independence. The army that faced the crisis of the 1070s was not the army that Basil II had commanded. The crisis arrived in 1071, a year that Byzantine historians would later identify as the hinge point of imperial history, the moment when the question changed from whether the empire would endure to what kind of empire it could still be. In April of that year, the Normans, descendants of the Norse settlers who had established themselves in northern France 2 centuries earlier, and who had been expanding aggressively around the Mediterranean for decades, captured the city of Bari in southern Italy, the last Byzantine foothold in the Western Peninsula. The Italian reconquest that Justinian had paid such enormous costs to achieve, which had been eroding since the Lombard invasions of the 6th century, was finally, definitively over. Then, in August of the same year, at a place called Manzikert in the highlands of eastern Anatolia near Lake Van, a Byzantine army commanded by the Emperor Romanos IV, Diogenes encountered the Seljuk Turkish forces of Alp Arslan and was destroyed. Romanos himself was captured, the first Byzantine emperor ever taken prisoner in battle. The ransom terms he negotiated were reasonable enough that he agreed to them and expected to return to his throne. He never did. His political enemies in Constantinople used his captivity and then his return as the occasion for a civil war that left him blinded and dead. Manzikert did not immediately end Byzantine control of Anatolia. That is a misreading that many history textbooks perpetuate. What it did was demonstrate that the Byzantine field army could no longer reliably defeat a major Turkish force in open battle, and in the decade of civil war that followed Manzikert, Turkish warlords and their followers poured into Anatolian valleys that had been solidly Byzantine for 4 centuries, establishing themselves in cities and agricultural regions that the distracted government in Constantinople had temporarily stopped defending. By the time Alexios I Komnenos seized the throne in 1081 and began the serious work of stabilizing the situation, much of Anatolia had already been lost in the sense that mattered most. The peasant populations that had sustained the theme armies and paid the agricultural taxes that funded the government were now under different control. Alexios could raid and negotiate and recover individual cities, but the demographic and economic foundation that Anatolian Anatolia had provided was gone, and no military campaign would fully restore it. Alexios I. Komnenos is one of the most interesting figures in Byzantine history, and one of the most difficult to evaluate fairly, partly because our most detailed source for his reign is the Alexiad, a biography written by his daughter Anna Komnene, who combined genuine historical talent with an understandable bias toward presenting her father in the most favourable possible light. He came to the throne at 33, inheriting an empire that was simultaneously under Norman attack in the Balkans, Turkish pressure in Anatolia, an internal financial crisis caused by decades of fiscal mismanagement. He dealt with the Normans through a combination of military resistance and the diplomatic masterstroke of bringing Venice into the conflict on the Byzantine side, granting Venetian merchants extraordinary trade privileges that amounted to a complete exemption from the customs duties that other traders paid. The Venetians received a commercial position in Constantinople that effectively gave them control of Byzantine foreign trade. It solved Alexios's immediate problem and created a long-term dependency on Venetian naval power that would eventually prove catastrophic. It was Alexios who sent the embassy to Pope Urban II in 1095, requesting Western military assistance against the Turks, an embassy that contributed to Urban's decision to call the First Crusade at Clermont. Alexios's actual request was probably fairly limited: trained soldiers who could serve in the Byzantine army under Byzantine command, helping recover Anatolian territory that Constantinople could then administer. What arrived instead was something quite different: several large armies of Western knights, motivated by a mixture of genuine religious conviction, land hunger, and ambitions for glory, commanded by independent nobles who owed allegiance to their own princes rather than to the Byzantine emperor, and who had their own ideas about what recovering the Holy Land meant, and who should control what was recovered. Alexios managed the First Crusade with considerable diplomatic skill, extracting oaths from the Crusade leaders that territories reconquered from the Turks would be returned to Byzantine suzerainty, using the crusading army as a tool to recover western Anatolia while it was still on its way to the Levant. He could not compel the Crusaders to honour their oaths once they were beyond his reach. The Crusader principalities established in Syria and Palestine were not under Byzantine authority, and the relationships between Constantinople and the Latin states of the East range from uneasy coexistence to active hostility, depending on the particular emperor and the particular Crusader lord involved at any given moment. The Komnenian dynasty, which ruled from 1081 to 1185, produced a remarkable recovery in some respects. The financial administration was stabilised. Parts of western Anatolia were recovered. The Balkans were pacified. The empire's cultural life flourished in ways that later historians would recognise as a genuine renaissance. But the structural problem was never solved. The grand strategy that had sustained the empire through the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, patient defence, controlled retreat, preservation of the core, required a fiscal and demographic base that the loss of Anatolia had permanently damaged. The Komnenian emperors compensated by increasingly relying on Western mercenaries, on the military service of the great noble families whose privileges they extended in exchange for loyalty, and on the commercial infrastructure that the Italian city-states, above all Venice, provided in exchange for ever more generous trade concessions. The empire was still powerful by the standards of the medieval world, but it was increasingly power built on borrowed foundations. John II Komnenos, who ruled from 1118 to 1143 and whom Byzantine historians considered the finest emperor of his dynasty, spent his reign in constant campaigning, recovering coastal Anatolia, reasserting Byzantine authority over the Crusader Principality of Antioch, conducting operations in the Balkans and into the interior of Anatolia with energy and discipline that recalled the great warrior emperors of the previous century. He died from an accidental arrow wound during a hunting expedition, an ending that combined the irony of so many warrior kings throughout history, surviving a dozen pitched battles only to be killed by a misfire in peacetime. His son Manuel I inherited his campaigning instinct, but applied it with less strategic discipline, conducting expensive campaigns in Italy, Hungary, and the Levant that extended the empire's military reach beyond its actual capacity to sustain gains. Manuel's defeat at Myricephalon in 1176 at the hands of the Seljuk Turks in the mountains of central Anatolia ended the possibility of Byzantine recovery of the Anatolian plateau and was recognised at the time as the final answer to the question of whether the empire could undo the consequences of Manzikert. It could not. The Fourth Crusade is one of history's most extraordinary case studies in how catastrophe can emerge from a sequence of individually reasonable decisions, each made by people who could not quite see where the chain was leading. It began in 1199 when Pope Innocent III called a new crusade to recover Jerusalem, which Saladin had recaptured in 1187. The crusade leadership arranged to transport the army by sea, contracting with Venice for ships and provisions. When the army assembled at Venice in 1202, it numbered substantially fewer men than the leaders had promised the Venetians, leaving a debt that the Crusaders could not pay. The Venetians, under their aged but formidably sharp Doge Enrico Dandolo, proposed a solution. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice recover the city of Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. The Crusaders agreed, sacked Zara, and were promptly excommunicated by the Pope for attacking a Christian city. They were still excommunicated when the next deflection occurred. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, whose father had been deposed by his uncle, arrived at the Crusader camp with a proposition. Help him recover Constantinople, restore his father to the throne, and he would pay the Crusader debt to Venice, provide provisions for the crusade, and submit the Orthodox Church to papal authority. He was promising things that a deposed prince with no resources had no means to deliver, but the offer was attractive to the crusade leadership, attractive enough to accept. The crusading fleet sailed to Constantinople in 1203. The Byzantine garrison, faced with an army on its walls and a fleet in its harbour, put up less resistance than expected. Alexios's father was restored as emperor. Alexios V was installed alongside him. Then the money did not appear, because there was no money. The empire had been bled by decades of mismanagement. The new emperor, unable to pay what his son had promised, was overthrown by a palace coup. a new emperor hostile to the Latins took power, and the Crusade leaders, camped outside a city that had failed to deliver what was promised and that had just become actively hostile, made a decision that altered the trajectory of medieval history. They attacked Constantinople. In April 1204, for the first time in the city's 874-year history, its walls were breached. The soldiers who broke through were not Persians or Arabs or Bulgarians or Turks. They were Western Christians, Latin Catholics, technically co-religionists of the Byzantine Greeks whose city they were sacking. The sack lasted 3 days. Centuries of accumulated wealth were looted or destroyed. Libraries were burned, churches were stripped. The great bronze horses that had stood at the hippodrome since ancient times, sculptures of such quality that no one in the medieval world could have cast them, were shipped to Venice, where they stand above the portal of San Marco's Basilica to this day, silent and permanent evidence of what was taken. The Crusaders established a Latin Empire of Constantinople. The Byzantine ruling class fled to 3 successor states in the provinces: the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in northwestern Greece, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast of Anatolia. Of these, the Empire of Nicaea would prove the most capable and the most determined to reclaim what had been lost. The Latin Empire lasted 57 years. It was never particularly stable, never fully accepted by the Greek population it nominally ruled, and was unable to extend its effective control much beyond Constantinople and a few surrounding territories. When Michael Palaiologos, the leading general of the Nicaean Empire, captured Constantinople in 1261, he did so through a night attack on a section of the walls that was lightly guarded because most of the Latin garrison had sailed off on a military expedition. The city was retaken with almost no fighting. Michael entered through the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance on the southern wall, and walked the length of the city to the Hagia Sophia for the Liturgy of Thanksgiving. He wept. According to the chronicles, most of those with him wept. The empire had been in exile for 57 years. Its ancient capital was home again. The empire that Michael VIII Palaiologos restored was a ghost of what had been lost, and both he and his successors knew it. The Latin occupation had been 60 years of economic extraction and cultural disruption. The empire's commercial position had been permanently reorganised in Venice's favour even before 1204, and the post-Reconquest empire could not realistically undo that arrangement. The Italian merchant communities, Venetians, Genoese and others, had their own quarters in Constantinople, their own courts, their own commercial networks that operated largely outside Byzantine jurisdiction. The Genoese, whom Michael had courted as allies against Venice during the Reconquest, were granted the suburb of Galata across the Golden Horn, where they established what amounted to an independent commercial republic, with its own walls and its own customs administration. Byzantine customs revenue declined sharply as trade passed through Italian hands. The empire was, economically, becoming a client of the Italian cities rather than a sovereign power in its own right. The political situation was equally constrained. The Palaeologian dynasty that Michael established and that would rule Constantinople until the city's final fall in 1453, the longest reigning dynasty in Byzantine history, presided over a state of continuous and accelerating contraction. In the west, the Balkans were contested by Bulgaria, Serbia, and various Latin principalities that had survived from the Crusader period. In the east, the Anatolian frontier that the Nicaean Empire had defended was immediately under pressure from Turkish principalities following the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate, pressure that would intensify dramatically with the emergence of the Ottoman state. Between military expenditure and the loss of commercial revenue to Italian middlemen, the imperial treasury was perpetually in crisis. Emperors debased the currency. They sold off crown jewels. The crown jewels that remained were reportedly replaced with glass substitutes when they were needed for ceremonial occasions, the genuine stones having been pawned long before. The imperial court maintained its elaborate ceremonial, its ranks and titles, its purple silk and gold mosaic, with a dignity that contemporary observers found either admirable or heartbreaking, depending on their disposition. The theological controversies that consumed Byzantine intellectual life in the 14th century have a similar quality of magnificent investment in questions that seem, from a political standpoint, utterly disconnected from the empire's survival needs. The Hesychast controversy, which dominated Byzantine religious and philosophical debate for much of the period between 1337 and 1351, concerned the question of whether the divine light seen by certain mystical practitioners during contemplative prayer, the light that the disciples had reportedly seen surrounding Christ at the Transfiguration, was created or uncreated, whether it was a finite phenomenon or something partaking of God's own eternal nature. The theologian Gregory Palamas, who defended the reality and uncreated nature of this divine light, eventually prevailed. His position was defined as orthodox doctrine at a series of councils. The controversy mattered to the people who argued about it with an intensity that the modern secular mind struggles to fully inhabit, because the question of how direct access to divine reality was possible or impossible had implications for the entire structure of monastic practice, theological authority, and the relationship between human beings and God. But the spectacle of an empire losing territory, annually spending its best intellectual energy on such questions, strikes later observers as poignant in a way that probably does no justice to either the questions or the people who asked them. The Ottoman threat had been developing gradually since the late 13th century, when Osman I established a small principality in northwestern Anatolia, in the borderlands between the declining Byzantine frontier and the collapsing Seljuk state. The Ottoman Ghazi warriors, fighting on the frontier of Islam against the Christian Empire, attracted recruits from across the Turkish world and beyond, with promises of plunder and spiritual merit simultaneously. Nicaean territory in Anatolia had held against this pressure during the exile period, largely because the Nicaean emperors had invested heavily in its defence and governed it effectively. The Palaeologian emperors, focused on the Balkans and the Italian commercial relationships and the theological controversies of Constantinople, gradually relaxed that investment. Byzantine cities in Anatolia fell one by one. Prusa in 1326, Nicaea itself in 1331, Nicomedia in 1337. The heartland of the empire that had preserved Byzantine civilization through the exile was gone by the mid-14th century. What remained was the city, and a few territories in the Balkans and on the Peloponnese. The Ottomans crossed into Europe in 1354 when an earthquake damaged the Byzantine fortifications at Gallipoli, and Ottoman forces occupied the position before the Byzantines could repair it. From that foothold, the expansion into the Balkans was rapid. Adrianople fell in 1369 and became the Ottoman capital, placing the empire's base of operations just across the frontier from Constantinople itself. The Serbian kingdom, which had itself briefly threatened to absorb Constantinople during the reign of Stephen Dusan in the 1340s, was broken at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. By the end of the 14th century, Constantinople was an island in an Ottoman sea, and had been effectively so for 2 generations. Byzantine emperors travelled to Western Europe to beg for assistance, demeaning journeys that produced impressive ceremonies, sympathetic words, and almost nothing practical. Emperor John VIII spent 2 years from 1423 to 1424 in Italy and France seeking help. Manuel II, his father, famously wrote a letter during a siege of the city that contained the phrase, "I have no other help but you." He was writing to Western rulers. They did not help. The one serious Western response to the Ottoman threat was the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, a French-Hungarian force that met the Ottoman army at a bend in the Danube and was destroyed. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, who had besieged Constantinople itself for 7 years between 1394 and 1402, was interrupted only by the invasion of the Central Asian conqueror Timur, who defeated and captured Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 and temporarily fragmented the Ottoman state. Constantinople received a 50-year reprieve from this intervention. The Ottomans reunified and returned. The reprieve was used not to rebuild defences or seek effective alliances, but largely to continue the theological debates and internal political conflicts that had characterised the empire for decades. There was an interlude of productive negotiation with Rome, producing the Council of Florence in 1439, at which Byzantine representatives formally agreed to a union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange for Western military assistance. The agreement was received with fury in Constantinople. The majority of the Byzantine population, the clergy, and the monastic communities preferred Ottoman rule to what they considered a betrayal of Orthodox theology. The famous remark attributed to Lucas Notaras, the Grand Duke of Constantinople, that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan in the city than the cardinal's hat, may or may not have been said in precisely those words. the sentiment it expressed was real and widespread. In the winter of 1452, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, extraordinarily capable and possessed of an ambition that he made no effort to conceal, began construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, the two fortifications gave the Ottomans complete control of the strait, cutting Constantinople off from the Black Sea and from the grain and supply ships that came south from the Black Sea ports. The message was unmistakable. Mehmed had been planning the final siege since his accession. He had engaged Hungarian engineers to cast enormous bronze cannon capable of firing stone balls of unprecedented size. He had organised an army that contemporary estimates placed at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, facing a city whose total available defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, including a few hundred Venetian and Genoese volunteers who had chosen to stay when the final crisis came. The siege began formally on April 6, 1453. The last Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, organised the defence with the resources he had and the dignity that his office required. He stretched the available defenders along miles of walls that had been built to accommodate a garrison many times larger. The great Theodosian walls, which had stood for 1,000 years and had never been successfully assaulted, held for 7 weeks against the largest cannon in the medieval world and the largest army the Ottomans had ever assembled for a single operation. Mehmed's enormous cannon, the largest reportedly required 60 oxen and 400 men to move and could fire only 7 times per day because it needed hours to cool between shots, created breaches in the walls that the defenders repaired each night with whatever materials were at hand: barrels of earth, wooden frames, rubble packed and tamped down against the collapsed stone. The defence of the sea walls was complicated by an Ottoman tactical innovation. Mehmed had wooden rollers laid along a hillside north of the Golden Horn and used them to drag a significant portion of his fleet overland from the Bosphorus into the Golden Horn, bypassing the great chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the harbour's entrance to keep the Ottoman navy out. Suddenly, Constantinople had a naval threat on the side it had believed was secure, and defenders had to be redistributed to cover the sea walls as well. The chain had been the key defensive element on the harbour side for centuries. The overland manoeuvre that made it irrelevant was one of the great feats of military engineering of the medieval world, and a demonstration of the quality of the military mind Mehmed commanded. In the early hours of May 29th, 1453, after a final desperate mass at the Hagia Sophia that contemporaries described as being attended by virtually the entire remaining population of the city, Orthodox and Latin, civilian and soldier, the last assault began. The initial wave of irregular fighters battered the breach in the walls. They were followed by Anatolian infantry. The defence held for 2 hours. Then a small gate called the Kirke Porta, used for sortie operations, was found either unlocked or inadequately guarded, and Ottoman soldiers poured through it into the space between the inner and outer walls. At roughly the same moment, the great Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who had been the single most effective organiser of the defence, was wounded. He asked to be carried off the walls. Constantine XI begged him to stay. He did not stay. When the defenders on the walls saw the Ottoman flags appearing within the wall system, and saw their commander being carried away, the resistance collapsed at the critical section. Ottoman soldiers poured over the breach. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, is reported to have removed his imperial regalia so that he could not be identified, and died fighting in the press at the walls. His body was never definitively identified. According to legend, angels took him. According to history, he simply disappeared into the final chaos of a city falling. Mehmed II rode into Constantinople later that day. He went first to the Hagia Sophia. The church had been converted into a mosque in the first hours of the conquest, one of the swiftest religious repurposings in the history of architecture. He reportedly stopped at the entrance, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Whether the story is true in detail, it captures something real about how Mehmed understood the moment. He had taken the city that the greatest empire in the world had defended for 11 centuries. He would spend the rest of his reign styling himself Caesar Rum, Caesar of Rome. He wanted to be the heir of Constantinople, not merely its conqueror. The city that surrendered to him in May 1453 had perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a fraction of the population it had held at its peak. many had fled in the weeks and months before the final siege, those who had the means and somewhere to go. Those who remained were not enslaved in large numbers. Mehmed was strategic enough to understand that a depopulated city was not worth ruling. He encouraged resettlement, moved in new populations, and worked to restore Constantinople's commercial function. Within a generation, the city's population was recovering. Within a century, Ottoman Constantinople, which the Turks called simply Constantiniye, was again one of the great cities of the world. What died in 1453 was not simply an empire. It was a particular conception of civilization, a continuous institutional thread that ran back through the medieval centuries to the ancient Roman state, and through that state to the Greek cities and the Hellenistic world that Rome had absorbed and transformed. The Byzantine state had preserved that thread with astonishing tenacity across 11 centuries of pressure that would have extinguished any other political entity many times over. It had survived the collapse of its western half, the loss of its richest provinces to Arab conquest, the diversion of crusading armies that should have been its allies, the half-century of Latin occupation, and the slow Ottoman strangulation of the Paleologian period. It had survived because its institutional culture, its legal tradition, its administrative habits, its theological sophistication, its capacity to absorb and adapt without losing the sense of continuity that gave the state its identity, proved more durable than almost anyone watching from outside had reason to expect. The scholars who fled Constantinople in the decades before and after 1453 carried manuscripts and knowledge into Italy that fed the Renaissance. This is not mythology. It is documented in considerable detail. Byzantine scholars such as George Gemistos Plethon, Manuel Chrysoloras, and Bessarion of Trebizond had been teaching Greek and introducing Western European scholars to ancient texts for decades before the final fall. After 1453, the flow of scholars increased. They brought Plato and Greek tragedy and medical texts and mathematical works that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries and were unknown or poorly known in the West. The Italian humanists who were already searching ancient texts for wisdom found in the Byzantine scholars living connections to the tradition they were trying to recover. The relationship was more complex and more mutual than the simple image of refugees carrying books suggests, but the contribution was real. The Orthodox Church, which had been the spiritual and cultural backbone of Byzantine civilization, survived the fall of Constantinople as an institution because Mehmed II found it useful to preserve it. He appointed a new patriarch, Gennadios Scholarios, a man who had opposed the union with Rome at Florence, and who could therefore serve as a legitimate head of the Orthodox community in Ottoman eyes. The Patriarchate of Constantinople continued to function under Ottoman suzerainty, maintaining its authority over Orthodox Christians throughout the empire and beyond. Russia, which had converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988 under Vladimir of Kiev and had been an ecclesiastical dependency of the Constantinople Patriarchate, assumed new importance after 1453. The Metropolitan of Moscow declared that Moscow was the Third Rome, the inheritor of Constantinople's spiritual authority. The idea proved extraordinarily durable in Russian political and religious culture. The Tsars, the Russian word derived from Caesar, claimed a continuity with the Byzantine imperial tradition that shaped Russian political theology for centuries. The legal tradition that Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis had codified survived in two directions: through the Byzantine canonical and civil law that the Orthodox churches carried into the Slavic world, shaping the legal cultures of Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania, and through the rediscovery of the corpus in Western Europe, where it had been studied in Bologna since the 11th century and had become the foundation of Roman law traditions that underlie the legal systems of France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and most of continental Europe. Modern legal systems that trace their ancestry through the Napoleonic Code or the German Civil Code are several times removed, descendants of the work done in Justinian's Constantinople in the early 6th century. The art and architecture of Byzantium left equally permanent marks. The dome of the Hagia Sophia influenced the design of Ottoman mosques. The great works of the architect Sinan, who designed the Suleymaniye and the Selimiye mosques in the 16th century, are in direct dialogue with the spatial logic of the building Anthemius and Isidore had created 1,000 years earlier. Byzantine mosaic technique, the gold ground tradition of representing sacred figures in heaven-lit space, passed through medieval Western Christian art to become part of the visual vocabulary through which European painters understood sacred representation for centuries. The icon tradition, which Byzantine theology had defended against iconoclasm at such cost, remained at the heart of Orthodox devotional practice from Constantinople to Moscow to Alexandria to Antioch, and through the 20th century's diaspora into every continent where Orthodox Christians have settled. The question of what Byzantium was and how to understand it has generated its own considerable historiographical tradition, and a few of the arguments are worth pausing over, because they affect how we read the story we have been telling. Edward Gibbon, whose Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire remains one of the great works of historical prose in the English language, treated Byzantium with barely concealed contempt, characterizing its history as one of superstition, palace intrigue, theological squabbling, and civilizational stagnation, interrupted only occasionally by moments of military effectiveness. The Gibbonian view was enormously influential and shaped Western academic historiography for over a century. Its fundamental premise, that genuine Roman civilization ended with the fall of the West in 476, and that what followed in the East was a decline rather than a transformation, is no longer seriously defended by Byzantine historians, though it persists in popular culture and in the use of Byzantine as an adjective meaning absurdly complicated and politically corrupt. The rehabilitation of Byzantine history as a legitimate field of serious scholarly attention was largely the work of the 20th century. Historians such as George Ostrogorsky, Cyril Mango, and Alexander Kazhdan demonstrated with considerable rigour that the Byzantine Empire was not a stagnant civilization treading water between ancient Rome and the Renaissance, but a dynamic and creative culture that produced genuine innovations in theology, law, art, administration, and diplomacy, that adapted with considerable flexibility to 11 centuries of changing circumstances, and that preserved and transmitted intellectual traditions without which the Renaissance could not have taken the forms it took. The current scholarly consensus, to the extent that anything as various as the scholarly community produces a consensus, is that Byzantium deserves to be understood on its own terms, as a distinctive civilization, neither simply Roman, nor simply Greek, nor simply Christian, but a synthesis of all three in proportions that shifted across the centuries, responding to pressures that would have destroyed states with less institutional depth. One of the most useful ways to understand Byzantine longevity is through the concept of what historians call Byzantinism, the empire's extraordinary capacity to maintain the idea of itself, the continuous institutional identity, the claim to Roman legitimacy, the ceremonial and theological framework, across periods of catastrophic material loss. The Byzantine state after 1261 was materially a small power, economically dependent on Italian merchants, militarily incapable of projecting force beyond its immediate surroundings. But it maintained the full panoply of imperial ceremony, the complete hierarchy of court titles, the elaborate theological and legal traditions, the monumental architecture of Constantinople, with a seriousness that was not simply delusion. The ceremony mattered because it maintained the idea of what the empire was, and that idea had practical consequences. It continued to attract loyalty, to organise diplomatic relationships, to give the church its authoritative centre. An empire that had reduced to the city and its suburbs held together for another 2 centuries, partly on the strength of what it had been and what it claimed still to be. The Byzantine approach to diplomacy was itself one of the civilization's most distinctive achievements, and one that its critics have sometimes misdescribed as mere cunning or manipulation. The imperial court developed over centuries a highly sophisticated theory and practice of managing relationships with neighbouring states and peoples through a combination of ritual, ideological positioning, generous gift-giving, dynastic marriage, and the calculated deployment of prestige. The idea that the emperor in Constantinople was the apex of a universal Christian order, with other rulers occupying subordinate positions in a hierarchy whose legitimacy derived from its relationship to the Roman imperial centre, was not simply propaganda. It was a functioning framework within which diplomatic negotiations could occur, within which titles and honours could be exchanged, that structured the relationship between Constantinople and the courts of Bulgaria, Russia, Serbia, Georgia, Armenia, and the Western kingdoms in ways that produced real political outcomes. The empire that could not afford to maintain large armies compensated with the organisational intelligence of its court, managing threats that it could not defeat militarily through the patient application of ceremony, theology, and the diplomatic arts. The religious dimension of Byzantine civilization deserves its own sustained attention because it was not separate from or opposed to the political and cultural life of the empire, but entirely continuous with it. Byzantium was a theocratic civilization in a sense that modern secular societies have difficulty fully inhabiting. The emperor was not divine, in the sense that the pagan Roman emperors had claimed divinity, but he was understood as the vicegerent of God on earth, the protector of the orthodox faith, the embodiment of the proper relationship between divine order and human governance. His coronation was a liturgical act. His victories in war were manifestations of divine favour. His defeats were evidence of divine displeasure and called for theological as well as military response. The theological controversies over Arianism, over iconoclasm, over the filioque clause and the precise relationship between the Father, Son and Holy Spirit, over the hesychast question of uncreated light, were not distractions from political life. They were political life in a civilization where the legitimacy of the government rested on its fidelity to divine truth. Getting theology wrong was not merely intellectually embarrassing. It was dangerous to the empire's standing before God, which was the same thing as being dangerous to the empire's survival. The monasteries that dotted the Byzantine landscape, from the mountain fastnesses of Mount Athos in Macedonia to the cave monasteries of Cappadocia in central Anatolia, played a role in Byzantine civilization that had no precise equivalent in the medieval West. They were spiritual centres, certainly, and their monks were the most visible practitioners of the ascetic and contemplative traditions that Byzantine Orthodox theology regarded as the highest human calling. But they were also economic entities of considerable importance, owning extensive agricultural land and operating as centres of craft production and manuscript copying. They were intellectual communities preserving ancient texts and producing theological and philosophical literature. They were political actors of real influence, since their abbots and the holy men who lived in them commanded a spiritual authority that even emperors had to treat with respect. The relationship between the imperial government and the monastic world was one of the most persistent creative tensions in Byzantine civilization, producing confrontations like the iconoclast controversy and negotiations like the ones that shaped the hesychast settlement, never quite resolving into simple hierarchy or simple opposition. The women of Byzantine history have received less attention than they deserve, partly because the sources are written largely by men and about men, and partly because the formal political structures of the empire excluded women from positions of official authority. But the informal influence exercised through the imperial court was considerable, and the occasional female ruler or regent exercised formal authority with the same combination of capability and ruthlessness that characterized the most effective male emperors. The Empress Theodora, Justinian's wife, was a former actress from the Constantinople circus, a background that the aristocracy found scandalous and that Procopius used to construct the most vitriolic character assassination in ancient historiography, the secret history, a document whose relationship to factual reporting has always been difficult to calibrate. What is clear is that she exercised real power in the governance of the empire, that Justinian appears to have genuinely valued her counsel, and that her intervention during the Nika riots saved his throne. Irene, who ruled as sole empress from 797 to 802, after blinding her own son to prevent him from reclaiming the throne, an act that even her contemporaries found difficult to entirely explain away, was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name rather than as regent for a minor. Zoe Porphyrogenita, who spent most of her long life in the women's quarters of the palace and was 50 when she first married, managed to cycle through 3 husbands and exercise sufficient influence that her image appears in a mosaic in the Hagia Sophia alongside 2 emperors, a distinction reserved for the most important figures of the imperial family. These were not passive figures. They were actors in a political world that required constant attention and considerable skill. The cultural and intellectual life of the Byzantine world across 11 centuries was richer and more various than its reputation in Western popular culture suggests, and a few specific figures and achievements deserve to be named rather than left as vague background. Procopius of Caesarea, who wrote the histories of Justinian's wars, the buildings celebrating imperial construction, and the scandalous secret history that circulated privately, was one of the finest historical writers between Thucydides and the Renaissance. His account of the plague of 541 is among the most detailed clinical descriptions of bubonic plague in ancient or medieval literature, and his history of Belisarius's campaigns is primary source material that no account of the period can ignore. Michael Psellos, who flourished in the 11th century and wrote a history of the emperors of his own time called the Chronographia, was a humanist intellectual a century before the Italian Renaissance used that word, a man who revived serious study of Platonic philosophy in Constantinople and who observed the political world around him with an ironic intelligence that makes his account of court life in Constantinople remarkably vivid across a millennium of distance. Anna Komnene, who wrote the Alexiad in the 12th century, was the first woman in European history to write a major work of historical prose. Her combination of classical learning, personal observation, and filial devotion to her father Alexios I produces a text that is at once a genuine historical source and a sustained argument about what her father's reign meant and how history should remember it. She had expected to rule the empire alongside her husband, was bitterly disappointed when her younger brother John was preferred, and spent her later years in a monastery writing history as what she described as a consolation for grief. The Alexiad is among the most sophisticated historical works produced in the Byzantine world, and the tradition of female learning and intellectual ambition it represents was not isolated but connected to the education provided to elite women in Byzantine Constantinople, which was broader and more serious than what their contemporaries in Western Europe typically received. The visual art of Byzantium achieved its greatest intensity in the centuries after the iconoclast controversy, as if the long argument about images had paradoxically sharpened the tradition's sense of what images could do. Byzantine mosaic at its peak, in monuments like the Church of the Holy Saviour in Chora in Constantinople, built largely in its current form in the early 14th century by the statesman and intellectual Theodore Metochites, achieves an effect that is genuinely unlike anything else in the visual art of any civilization. The figures in Byzantine mosaic inhabit a gold space that is simultaneously the space of heaven and the space of the image itself, neither the illusionistic depth that Renaissance painting would develop, nor the purely symbolic flatness of certain earlier traditions, but something specific to the theological purposes the images were designed to serve. They address the viewer directly, with an intensity that generations of worshippers experienced as presence rather than representation. The Desis mosaic in the Hagia Sophia, probably from the 13th century, showing Christ enthroned between the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist, with a psychological gravity and aesthetic sophistication that is genuinely stunning, is among the masterworks of world art in any period. The architecture of Byzantine Constantinople has been partly lost to time and largely transformed by the 5 centuries of Ottoman rebuilding, but enough survives and enough is known from textual description that its character can be recovered. The city at its height in the 10th and 11th centuries was a place of monuments on a scale that nothing in contemporary Western Europe approached. The Hippodrome, which seated perhaps 100,000 spectators, was decorated with statues brought from across the ancient world. The Million, the golden milestone from which all distances in the empire were measured, stood near the entrance to the imperial palace complex. The Messe, the main colonnaded street, ran through the city from the Golden Gate to the Augustean, lined with the shops and workshops of a city that was still the commercial heart of the Mediterranean world. The imperial palace complex, which occupied the southeastern quarter of the city between the Hippodrome and the sea, was an accretion of buildings added by successive emperors over centuries, a labyrinth of throne rooms, chapels, gardens, barracks, and audience halls that no single coherent plan could describe. The Byzantine Empire's relationship with what we would now call soft power was sophisticated enough that it can plausibly be called a deliberate strategy. The conversion of the Bulgarians under Boris I in 864 was accomplished partly by Byzantine missionaries carrying Orthodox Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet, which Cyril and Methodius had created specifically for the Slavic languages on imperial initiative, and partly by the implicit offer that accepting Byzantine religious forms meant access to Byzantine cultural prestige, Byzantine trade networks, and Byzantine diplomatic recognition. The Christianization of Russia under Vladimir of Kiev in 988 followed a similar pattern. Vladimir reportedly sent emissaries to observe the religious practices of the neighbouring peoples, the Muslim Bulgars, the Jewish Khazars, the Catholic Germans, and the Orthodox Byzantines, and chose orthodoxy partly on the strength of his emissary's report that when they attended the liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth, so beautiful was the worship. Whether the story is literally true is beside the point. it captures something real about the role that Byzantine ceremonial splendour played in its diplomacy, and about the model it offered to rulers of neighbouring peoples who were constructing their own states and seeking a tradition of legitimacy and cultural refinement to adopt. The Greek language, which had been the literary and liturgical medium of Byzantine civilization since the 7th century's administrative shift away from Latin, carried classical texts through the medieval centuries in the hands of the scholars who copied, annotated and argued about them in the monasteries and schools of Constantinople and the provincial centres. Aristotle's logical works had passed into Arabic translation in the 9th century and returned to Western Europe via Arabic scholarship and Latin translation in the 12th. But the complete Aristotle, the physical, biological, psychological and ethical works, came largely through Byzantine channels. Plato was even more specifically a Byzantine transmission. It was the Byzantine scholars who brought him to Italian humanists, who had known only fragments through Latin intermediaries, and the enthusiasm of those Italian scholars for Platonic philosophy in the 15th century was in direct response to the Byzantine scholars who introduced them to the full corpus. Before we arrive at that final century, it is worth pausing on the particular texture of Byzantine daily life in the city at its height, because empires are not only the sum of their sieges and their theological controversies, they are also the sum of the mornings and evenings of the people who lived inside them, and the Constantinople of the 9th and 10th centuries was a city with a specific quality of daily experience that deserves some attention. The city woke early, as most medieval cities did, with the bells of churches cutting through the darkness before dawn. Constantinople had hundreds of churches, from the enormous Hagia Sophia and the Church of the Holy Apostles, where the emperors were buried, down to tiny neighbourhood chapels tucked into the corners of insulae in the middle of residential districts. The liturgy was the fixed rhythm around which the day organised itself, not merely as a matter of obligation, but as the primary communal gathering, the occasion at which neighbours who might otherwise be strangers became members of a community with a shared purpose and a shared story. The Orthodox liturgy in the Byzantine period was, and remains, a long, elaborate performance involving choir, incense, candlelight, vestments of considerable splendour, and readings that moved through the entire cycle of the church year in a pattern that gave the Byzantine calendar its fundamental shape. The Messe, the main colonnaded street that ran through the centre of the city, was the commercial and social spine of Constantinople's public life. Shops opened onto it in the covered arcades that lined both sides. The trades were organised by location in the same guild-based system that the eparch, the city prefect, supervised through the Book of the Eparch, a 9th century administrative document that gives us remarkably detailed insight into how the commercial life of the city was organised. The silk merchants occupied one area, the jewellers another, the money changers another. The market gardeners who supplied the city with vegetables arrived before sunrise from the truck farms outside the walls. The fishermen from the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara set up their stalls near the harbour. The smell of fresh bread from bakeries, of fish on wooden boards, of incense drifting from church doorways, of animals and people in close proximity that is simply what dense urban life smelled like before modern sanitation. These were the sensory textures of the city's days. The hippodrome races, which had been the empire's most spectacular public entertainment since Constantine's day, remained central to Constantinople's civic culture well into the medieval period. The Blues and Greens, the two great racing factions, were far more than sports supporters in the modern sense. They organised neighbourhood life, provided mutual aid to their members, performed certain ceremonial functions at court events, and served as the primary mechanism through which public opinion was communicated to the emperor in a political system where formal political opposition was impossible. An emperor who sat in his kathisma, the imperial box that connected directly to the palace, watching the races while the crowd below cheered or jeered or chanted political demands, was engaging in a kind of public accountability that had no equivalent in the medieval West. It was limited and often dangerous. The Nika riots of 532 demonstrated how quickly hippodrome politics could turn lethal, but it was real. The education available in Constantinople was, by the standards of the medieval world, remarkably extensive. The imperial university, periodically reorganised and refunded by interested emperors, trained the administrators, lawyers, physicians, and theologians that a complex state required. Private teachers, often monks or clergy, provided instruction in classical rhetoric and philosophy. The texts they worked with were the same ones that had been taught in the schools of antiquity: Homer, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, the Attic orators. The Byzantine educated class read ancient Greek not as a dead language, but as the prestige literary form of their own civilization, the medium in which serious thought was expressed, even as the spoken language had evolved considerably from classical norms. This created a cultural situation of considerable complexity, a living civilization conducting its intellectual life largely through the linguistic medium of a civilization that had ended 1,000 years earlier, maintaining contact with the ancient world through a continuous educational tradition that never quite admitted a clean break. The economic life of the Byzantine Empire deserves its own careful attention, because the empire's fiscal system was in many respects its most impressive achievement, and the one whose gradual erosion most directly caused the political collapse. The Byzantine state inherited from Rome an elaborate taxation system based on careful land surveys that established the agricultural productivity of individual plots and assessed taxes accordingly. The system required regular updating. Land quality changed, populations moved, natural disasters reduced productivity. But when it was maintained with reasonable care, it gave the imperial government a predictable revenue base that was the envy of every other medieval state. The 10th century Byzantine treasury, at the height of the Macedonian period, held reserves of gold that Western European rulers could not have imagined accumulating in several lifetimes. When the Emperor Basil II died in 1025, he left a treasury that contained 200,000 pounds of gold, the largest accumulated reserve in the medieval world. The gold solidus, the Byzantine coin that had maintained its gold content and its weight with remarkable consistency since Constantine's introduction of it in the early 4th century, was the international reserve currency of the medieval world. It circulated from England to China, from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, recognised and trusted everywhere as a reliable store of value in a world where most currencies were subject to debasement and manipulation. Merchants in Baghdad and Alexandria and the Crimea conducted their transactions in nomismata, as the Byzantines called their gold coin, or in local currencies explicitly pegged to its value. This monetary dominance was not merely economic. It was a form of soft power, a daily demonstration in the markets of the known world that Constantinople was the centre from which value radiated outward. Byzantine control of the trade routes between East and West was the foundation of this prosperity. Silk, which originated in China, and whose production method was a closely guarded secret that the rest of the world was willing to pay extravagant prices not to have to know, flowed westward through Persia and across the Anatolian plateau to Constantinople, where Byzantine merchants and state workshops processed, dyed and sold it to Western European buyers at prices that made Byzantine silk dealers fabulously wealthy. The story of how the Byzantine Empire eventually acquired the secret of silk production. 2 Nestorian monks who smuggled silkworm eggs out of China in hollow walking staffs during the reign of Justinian, bringing them successfully to Constantinople, where they hatched, and the Byzantine silk industry was born, has the quality of a fable, but is reported by Procopius, and is probably essentially true in its outlines. The Byzantine silk industry, concentrated in state-controlled workshops in Constantinople, produced textiles of such quality and such distinctive colour, the imperial purple dyed from the murex shellfish that gave Byzantine purple its particular shade, that Byzantine silk was itself a diplomatic instrument, given as gifts to foreign rulers and eagerly received as evidence of the donor's access to the most prestigious manufactures in the known world. The spice trade, the trade in ivory and precious stones, the trade in slaves and furs from the northern steppes, the trade in grain from the Black Sea coast. All of these passed through Constantinople at volumes that made the city the wealthiest single point in the medieval Mediterranean economy for most of the period between the 4th and 12th centuries. The Byzantine state taxed this trade, and the customs revenues from the ports and the straits were a significant fraction of the imperial budget. When the Italian merchants, first the Venetians under the commercial treaty that Alexios I granted in 1082, then the Genoese under the treaty that Michael VIII granted in exchange for their help with the reconquest in 1261, secured exemptions from these customs duties, they were receiving a subsidy of extraordinary value, a free pass through the most commercially active choke point in the medieval world. The Byzantine state was, in effect, paying its security bills in commercial revenue, and the cost of that arrangement accumulated over the following centuries into the fiscal crisis that left the Palaeologian Empire unable to maintain its army. The military organisation of the Byzantine Empire in its mature period was one of the most sophisticated in the medieval world, and not simply because of the theme system and the Greek fire and the Theodosian walls, though all of these mattered enormously. It was sophisticated because Byzantine military thought had been continuous and cumulative in a way that no Western European military tradition could match. The Strategikon, attributed to the Emperor Maurice, and probably composed around 600 CE, was a military manual of remarkable practical intelligence that covered tactics, logistics, intelligence gathering, the management of different types of cavalry and infantry, the handling of sieges and the defence of fortified positions, and the specific characteristics of the various peoples the Byzantine army was likely to face on different frontiers: Persians, Avars, Slavs, Turks, and the tactical approaches best suited to each. It was followed by a tradition of military literature that continued across the centuries, each generation adding to an accumulated body of practical knowledge that Byzantine commanders studied and applied. The Emperor Nikephoros Phocas himself wrote a manual on military tactics. The Precepta Militaria, composed probably in the 960s, shows a commander who had spent decades on the eastern frontier thinking carefully and systematically about how cavalry operations should be organised and how different tactical situations required different responses. The most famous military unit of the Byzantine army in its later centuries was the Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the emperor recruited from Scandinavian warriors, Norsemen, Rus, and later Englishmen who had fled England after the Norman conquest of 1066. The Varangians carried double-headed axes, spoke languages that most Byzantines found incomprehensible, and were known for a combination of ferocious loyalty and equally ferocious drinking that made them simultaneously the most reliable and the most difficult element of the imperial military establishment to manage. They had come to Byzantine service initially in large numbers in 988, when Vladimir of Kiev sent 6,000 Norse warriors as part of the arrangement that led to his own baptism and the Christianization of Russia. The Emperor Basil II, who was at that moment fighting two simultaneous rebellions and needed reliable troops who had no local political connections and thus no local political ambitions, found 6,000 Norse axemen exactly what the situation required. The Varangians became permanent, evolving over the following century from a predominantly Scandinavian to a predominantly Anglo-Norse to an eventually mixed force, but retaining their distinctive character as soldiers who served the emperor personally and who stood apart from the complex political currents of Byzantine court life by virtue of their foreignness. The story of Harold Hardrada, who served in the Varangian Guard in the 1030s and 1040s, before returning to Norway and eventually dying at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, in the same month that William the Conqueror was landing in England, is one of those historical moments where several trajectories cross in a way that makes the medieval world feel both very large and very small simultaneously. Harold fought in Sicily, in Bulgaria, in Asia Minor, in the Mediterranean pirate suppression campaigns that the Byzantine fleet conducted along the Anatolian and Levantine coasts. He accumulated wealth and military experience in Constantinople's service before deciding that the Kingdom of Norway was a more interesting prize than the pay of a mercenary guard captain. His saga, preserved in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, describes his Byzantine service with the kind of impressed specificity that suggests genuine acquaintance with what Constantinople actually was. It was, for a Norse warrior from the far north of Europe, the most extraordinary city in the known world. The question of the empire's final century, from roughly 1350 to 1453, is one that invites a certain kind of retrospective melancholy that is probably not the most useful analytic stance but is hard to entirely avoid. The empire was visibly dying in the sense that any political entity is dying when its territory contracts annually, its tax revenue is insufficient to maintain its army, its ruling class spends as much energy on theological dispute and dynastic rivalry as on practical survival, and its neighbours are no longer taking it seriously as a military threat. And yet the cultural and intellectual life of Constantinople in the Palaeologian period was in some respects the richest it had ever been. The theological synthesis of Gregory Palamas, the history of Nikephoros Gregoras, the philosophical work of George Gemistos Plethon, who astonished his Italian contemporaries with his apparent revival of pagan Platonic religion, and who proposed, seriously, a reform of Byzantine society on Platonic principles. The mosaic programs of churches funded by aristocrats who could no longer afford armies, but still commissioned master craftsmen to fill their private chapels with gold-ground images of extraordinary quality. The tension between the external decline and the internal flowering is one of the most genuinely strange things about the late Byzantine world, and it makes it genuinely difficult to know what to make of the period. A civilization aware of its own ending, producing its finest cultural work in the generation before it ended, is not the phenomenon that simple narratives of decline adequately capture. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, has something of the quality of a figure from Homeric tragedy, a man of genuine dignity and limited resources doing everything that could be done with what he had, and having it not be enough. He had been administering the Peloponnese, the one significant Byzantine territory outside Constantinople itself, when he was called to the throne in 1449. He knew when he accepted it that he was accepting a siege. He spent his 4 years as emperor organising the defence with the seriousness that the occasion required, and without any of the self-deception that might have made it more comfortable. He wrote to potential allies knowing the responses would be inadequate. He maintained the ceremonial dignity of an emperor who commanded an empire when the territory he commanded was a single city. When the final assault came, he died at the walls like a soldier rather than an emperor, which is the same thing as saying he died according to the deepest standards of what Byzantine civilization had always said an emperor should be. The purple is a noble burial shroud. Theodora had said it 500 years earlier in an equally desperate moment. Constantine proved it true. When Mehmed II's call to prayer sounded for the first time in the Hagia Sophia on May 29, 1453, the Byzantine Empire ended. But the questions it had raised about the relationship between church and state, about the grounds of political legitimacy, about the preservation of classical knowledge, about the organisation of law, about the possibility of a universal Christian civilization, did not end with it. They passed into the cultures that inherited pieces of the Byzantine legacy, and continued working through them in forms the Byzantines themselves would not always have recognised, but that carried traces of the original arguments. Russia's claim to be the Third Rome, the inheritor of Byzantine religious and imperial authority, shaped Russian political culture from the 16th century through the fall of the Romanov dynasty in 1917 and arguably beyond. The Russian Orthodox Church, with its direct institutional lineage from the Constantinople Patriarchate, maintained the theological and liturgical traditions that Byzantine scholarship had shaped, and the Tsar's image of themselves as protectors of Orthodox Christianity against Catholic and later secular threats was explicitly modelled on the Byzantine imperial conception. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s drew on Byzantine historical memory as a source of national identity, and modern Greek national consciousness has always had a complicated relationship with the Byzantine legacy, sometimes claiming it proudly, and sometimes setting it against a different classical Greek identity that Byzantine Greeks would not have entirely recognised as their own. The Orthodox churches of Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania and Georgia all carry institutional and cultural inheritance from Constantinople that has shaped their national identities in ways that are still entirely active. The legal tradition is perhaps the most globally pervasive inheritance because it is the least visible. The civil law systems that govern the daily legal lives of the majority of the world's population, the French, Italian, Spanish, German, and their derivative systems in South America, East Asia and Africa, descend through the corpus juris civilis that Justinian's scholars compiled in Constantinople in the early 6th century. When a French court applies the principle of good faith in contract law, or a German court reasons about the hierarchy of legal norms, or a Japanese court interprets a civil code provision that was translated from German in the 19th century, the intellectual DNA includes decisions made by Tribonian and his colleagues in a city on the Bosphorus 1500 years ago. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary way that legal traditions work, through textual transmission, institutional continuity, and the slow transformation of inherited frameworks in response to new circumstances. The Hagia Sophia itself, which became the Hagia Sophia Mosque after 1453 and a museum in 1934, and a mosque again in 2020, stands as the most visible and contested piece of the Byzantine physical legacy. The building has been continuously in use for nearly 15 centuries, which makes it one of the longest functioning architectural monuments in the history of human civilization. The layers of its use are physically present in the structure. Byzantine mosaic gold still visible beneath painted plaster in some areas, Ottoman calligraphic medallions in Arabic hanging in a space designed for Greek Christian liturgy, the mathematical elegance of 6th century structural engineering still holding up a dome that later architects studied as one of the supreme achievements of their craft. It is a building that belongs simultaneously to multiple histories that are not entirely reconcilable with each other, which makes it an unusually honest monument to the complexity of the world that produced it. There is something in the Byzantine story that resists the narrative forms we usually use for the fall of empires. Empires typically end with a bang or a whimper. The bang is a catastrophic defeat, a sacked capital, a dynasty overthrown in a day. The whimper is a slow dissolution, an empire that realizes at some point that it has already ended without anyone noticing. Byzantium managed both simultaneously across different centuries. The catastrophe of 1204 and the sack by the Fourth Crusade was certainly a bang. The slow, Ottoman strangulation of the Paleologian period was certainly a whimper, and yet the empire survived the bang and continued during the whimper with remarkable composure. The final fall in 1453 was a bang, certainly. The city taken, the emperor dead at the walls, the last liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, the call to prayer. But what is perhaps most remarkable about the story is that it keeps not ending when it should. Every time the narrative logic of decline and fall seems to have reached its conclusion, the Byzantines find a way to continue. The 3rd century's crisis should have ended the empire and Diocletian rebuilt it. The Arab conquests of the 7th century should have ended it, and the theme system preserved it. The Macedonian emperors lost Anatolia at Manzikert and the empire found Nicaea. The Fourth Crusade drove the empire into exile, and it came back. That capacity for recovery is not unlimited. Eventually 1453 is 1453 and there is no recovery. But it is extraordinary enough across 11 centuries that it deserves to be the central thing we take from the story. What made that capacity possible was not any single factor, but a combination of factors that reinforced each other. The geography of Constantinople, which made it genuinely very difficult to take by force, and which continued to give whoever controlled it an advantage in trade and communications that no one in the medieval world could easily replicate. The institutional depth of the state, its legal tradition, its administrative habits, its theological framework, which gave it a coherent identity that survived territorial loss in ways that simpler states could not have managed. The cultural prestige of the Byzantine tradition, which made conversion to Byzantine norms, religious, political, aesthetic, attractive to neighbouring peoples in ways that translated into diplomatic and military support at crucial moments. And the simple stubbornness of the people who inhabited the city and the empire, who went on maintaining their civilization through centuries of pressure that would have convinced a less rooted population that the project was no longer worth the effort. The story of Byzantium is not a story of inevitable decline from Roman greatness to medieval stagnation. It is a story of continuous transformation, of a civilization that was always in the process of becoming something new, while insisting that it remained the same thing it had always been. The Byzantines were Roman in 330, and Roman in 1453, but the Romanness of 1453 was so different from the Romanness of 330 that the continuity was largely a matter of institutional memory, an ideological commitment rather than literal similarity. They held the idea of themselves in common across the centuries, and that shared idea proved strong enough to hold the civilization together through stresses that should have broken it. The city on the Bosphorus is now Istanbul, one of the largest cities in the world, a place of 17 million people, where the Blue Mosque and the Suleymaniye echo the spatial logic of a building that Anthemius and Isidore designed 15 centuries ago. The Golden Horn still catches the light in the mornings. The Theodosian walls still stand, or large sections of them, their stone courses massive and patient, the towers more ruined than when they kept Arab fleets out of the harbour, but still recognisably what they always were. The Bosphorus still narrows between two continents in exactly the way that Constantine's eye understood when he chose the site. The place is still the place. The water is still the water. What it contains and what it means and who claims it have changed many times and will change again. But for 11 centuries, from 330 to 1453, the empire that called itself Roman, and that history, calls Byzantine, looked out from that city across the strait, where Europe and Asia pressed closest together and did what empires do. It governed and taxed and fought and prayed and argued and built and preserved and occasionally destroyed and very often repaired what others destroyed. It lasted longer than any European political institution before or since. It shaped the religious, legal, artistic and intellectual inheritance of the modern world in ways that run so deep they are usually invisible. And when it finally fell, it fell not because it had run out of ideas or energy or the will to continue, but because the Ottoman state was simply too large, too well organised, and too determined for any city, however magnificent, to hold at bay forever. Constantine XI died at the walls of the city his predecessor Constantine had built 11 centuries before. The wheel had come around. 11 centuries is a long time to keep a wheel turning. By any reasonable measure of what a civilization is supposed to accomplish, endure, transmit, adapt, preserve, Byzantium succeeded beyond what anyone watching its beginning could have predicted, or what anyone watching its end could entirely grasp. The night is settling in now, and the long story has reached its end, or rather the end that history chose for it, which is not quite the same thing. The Hagia Sophia is still standing. The Theodosian walls are still standing, more or less. The Orthodox liturgy is still sung in the same language, with the same gestures, in the same theological tradition that the councils and the scholars of Constantinople worked out over those 11 centuries. The legal codes that Tribonian organised under Justinian are still the living foundation of legal systems governing billions of people. The manuscripts that Byzantine scholars preserved and the Italian humanists received and the printing presses multiplied are still the texts on which Western education has rested for 5 centuries. The mosaics of the Cura Church still catch the light that enters through their windows, gold-ground figures addressing the viewer with the same directness they have maintained for 700 years. Empires are supposed to leave ruins. Byzantium left things that still function, still speak, still shape how human beings organise their laws and pray their prayers and understand the space inside a dome. That is an unusual kind of persistence. It is, perhaps, what the empire that refused to fall finally settled for when falling became unavoidable, not continuing to exist, but continuing to matter. Let that settle in quietly now. The Bosphorus is dark. The city that sat on it for 11 centuries is sleeping under a different name. The wheel has turned many times since Constantine poured earth on his own head in the Hagia Sophia, and will turn many more. But some things move with the wheel, and some things remain when the wheel has passed. And Byzantium, improbably, stubbornly, magnificently, is among the latter. Rest easy.